Okay, so I'm getting just the worst sense of deja vu starting out this prelude, because I know in the last prelude, what I said just ended up being so hollow. I say at the beginning, the video is going to be majority audio stuff, and the camcorder stuff is just going to be very brief. And then I talked for the camcorder. I talked for over 30 minutes, where I think more than half the video ended up being non-audio and just me ranting at the camcorder. This time, it will be different. This will be an actual short prelude. The majority of this video will, in fact, be audio-only stuff. 2 days ago, I recorded just so much in terms of audio. I just had so many things to just flush out of my system, and I did it. But I do need to do a very brief prelude, because there was a hard swerve within about 15, 20-minute mark. I'm talking about this educational stuff again, referencing how I'm watching my last video and I'm expanding on it even more. And then I did a hard swerve to something that I didn't define. I'm not going to try to define it now, because then I know I run the risk of, like, what's an adequate enough definition? What's a comprehensive definition? And I don't trust myself to toe the line in terms of keeping that definition short. Plus, it's kind of noisy, so yeah, this is very distracting. But I do swerve hard, and just so you know that in case you're listening only, and in case you've never heard of it, the thing that I swerve into, there will be screenshots, there will be definitions, there will be kind of visual cues for laying the groundwork for what that sort of thing is. I'm going to link to, right now I have one paper that I want to link to it. By the time I decide to finally upload this, I think there's going to be multiple papers that are very insightful. The other short qualifier is, what I do once I swerve, it just sounds more and more like the sort of thing that can on credible grounds be accused, where I can be accused of victim blaming, because it's kind of in line with, I say evo psych, but it's more evolutionary biology than evolutionary psychology, so that's the other kind of quick corrective. I say evo psych, but on a plausible enough reading, it's more evolutionary biology that this kind of research is drawn from. And I'm in no way victim blaming. I'm in no way courting genetic determinism. At some point in the audio I say it's almost genetically destined. Emphasis on the almost. I'm not making the case for genetic determinism. I'm just saying that when people fall into the kind of bucket of fast life history strategy, which is the thing that I referenced and I don't define, but that's fine, because I'll screenshot a lot of things that will give a snapshot of it. It's very hard to course correct once that kind of a dramatic environment made its impression on the spawn. It's very hard in my experience to course correct on that. And it ties into this grievance I have about sex ed only going halfway in terms of referencing things. So like sex ed, they use terms like late bloomer very often, and then they wouldn't expand on it further to get into the subject of fast life history, slow life history, levels of parental investment, different mating strategies, and these kinds of life histories very much being associated with life expectancy. There's an association here that just all of this research I had to do on my own decades after, instead of incorporating it into the sex ed curriculum, which it would have been so much more insightful, instead of just going so far and say, some of you are late bloomers and some of you are early bloomers, and just leaving it there. It's like, well, what kind of things contribute to some people being late and early bloomers? And they just didn't go into it. And it's not to victim blame anyone in terms of people having this fast life history lending itself to what I'm going to go on to say is a kind of fast life jeopardy. We can talk about prudentially bad actions without associating them with morally wrong actions. Because at some point I said, people who are so quick to accuse others of victim blaming, they want to say that this is like two peas in a pod. The moment you are using terms like prudentially bad, which members of the general public, they don't use, right? And so then the kind of people who are very eager to accuse non-victim blamers of being victim blamers, right? If people were as cautious as I am with how they select their terms, it would be very hard, because, God, on second thought, that's way too lengthy and drawn out. An explanation for a short prelude. I'm going to cut out the last couple of minutes and just kind of bottom line it to when you know to be as kind of anal and as technical and as cautious with the terms you pick as the philosophical crowd is, like when you don't want to victim blame, you use the word like prudentially bad. It's a prudentially bad decision. And then when you do want to point out why somebody did something that we can call into question on moral grounds, then you just use a word like wrong. Right? This sort of stuff will help you stay out of the gauze of people whose kind of claim to fame, sophistry-wise, is to over-ascribe the amount of victim blaming that goes on in society. So yeah, I just gave out this drawn-out, unnecessary explanation for what is supposed to be a short prelude. So I'll just kind of bottom line it to always, when you don't intend to victim blame, just be aware of the terms you're using. When you say prudentially bad, no one in their right mind has any kind of a legitimate ground to associate the point you want to make to morally wrong. And anytime it's a term like blaming, it has to have that kind of moral underlying theme. If they want to say you're victim blaming just because you accused someone of making an imprudent decision, well, I'd love to see them argue that with a straight face. Because the ultimate cause for that doesn't necessarily have to be a moral shortcoming on the part of the individual. And so just a kind of quick analogy is people who flunk tests and flunk tests badly, they never do anything morally wrong, but they nonetheless flunk the test. There's a performance issue there, right? But it doesn't reflect badly on them as people. You can just say it reflects badly on them as test takers, but even then that's not the whole story if you watch my last video. And so something like that can be applied to this context of people who get into a fast life jeopardy precisely because they're not even wired. It's not even an innate thing, but it's a product of their very dramatic and fast-paced environment that they were just lunged into, and it's all they've ever known from the time they were born, right? It does lead to a kind of jeopardy, and it's a kind of jeopardy that I want to discuss at length, and I do so in the audios. So, yeah, short prelude, under 10 minutes. I'll snip out my drawn-out, prudentially bad versus morally wrong thing, so enjoy the audios. I've got some stuff to add when you look at all these themes within education and reforming education and how just no one's hitting the bullseye as I see it. I don't want to do several videos on this, but I do have to add, because I want to use a word like university dupes, uni dupes maybe. I understand some people go to university. It's the best thing they could have possibly done. I just think we seriously overestimate the percentages here, because what makes someone a university dupe? Well, I touched on it in the last video when I said, well, it doesn't, like, you're a university dupe even if it doesn't bother you that your crowd gets, in America, by way of federal assistance, your crowd gets 164 billion annually, whereas the trades crowd gets just slightly over $1 billion annually. You're a kind of dupe who's okay with it's a form of protectionism, we can look at it. And if you're telling these bright-eyed stories about your university journeys, you should know that the protectionism can be a part of that story. But anyway, I don't even want to hang on that part, how much they invest, because we can just bring it to the issue of student loan forgiveness. And see, now I forget what it is. Is it 10,000 per student that they forgave? It was somewhere, I just remember from last year, the number that was quoted over and over again was 10,000, but the number is irrelevant. If you were assisted, you are by definition a university dupe, and you had to learn the hard way, right? But I can't even say they learned the hard way, because no one's having regret. It's not that, oh, I was helped by the government because I was a dupe. It's I was helped by the government because I was wronged. Because there was predatory lending. They use this term, predatory lending, but they can't even say that they made a mistake. They were duped into it because they weren't anti-tuition from the start. They couldn't grant the realistic possibility that college and university professors didn't know much about their objective best interests and how that impacts their time management and what they, as people, as young adults, pay attention to, and really what they have to pay attention to, and not just to get to secure this great future that's superior to any alternative future, but just to not flunk out and then quickly come to fear joblessness. It always felt bizarre to me that someone would, monetary gains aside, someone would sign up to be told by a perfect stranger how they should spend a disproportionate share of their time. Their newly minted adult time, right? When you're an adult, you're supposed to be told, you're supposed to have this sense of independence, but really, so many of these issues that get worse as high school goes on, more and more of your time is being taken up by, plausibly, right? This is not different now. More and more of your time is going to be eaten up when you transition from grade 8 to grade 9, 9 to 10. As the grades keep piling on, the difficulty level rises, and so does the amount of time, your own post-school time, taken up by assignments and various kinds of cramming, right? And so really, when you become an adult, we have this terminology of independence, but because so many kids get encouraged to go to college and university, you're not really being encouraged to think more about how you spend that precious, I'm going to call it newly minted adult time, just because so many young adults are encouraged to have a stranger tell them, in effect, what to do. And those loads only increase post-secondary. And so why the trust? Just because that stranger, who's, let's say, your favorite professor, let's say you have even a favorite professor, but you ended up being one of these people who had to be bailed out, essentially, because you couldn't figure out that there's this looked predatory at T1, and you only realized that at T2, once your debt had actually accumulated, you couldn't see the predatoriness because you were just so doughy-eyed at this narrative that a lot of, I don't want to start going off about college movies, because I think even just for so many decades, these college movies made it seem as if college was not even just from an educational standpoint, from a life milestone standpoint. Don't pretend that Hollywood and various other aspects of pop culture didn't glamorize the college experience and made it seem as if missing that as a milestone is on par with missing many other milestones that, well, if you ask me, you still shouldn't care about, because milestones are artificial. But anyway, so like, why the trust? Why think that this professor, who may in some ways, know a lot about a subject that you're interested in, he's still going to impose a timetable on you, a regimen on you? Why? Just blindly, you don't know him from Adam, and yet you're going to put your newly minted adult time in his hands just because he's employed by this institution, and maybe you can say a rubber stamp by this institution that you also think highly of, right? I wish people would use a term like Yale derangement syndrome, Harvard derangement syndrome. I don't care about that, right? That doesn't suggest to me that this admittedly learned person has any say in terms of what I do, what I focus on for several hours a week, or in the worst cases, several hours a day when we think about cramming. This person, this rando, you need to think pre-institutionally when it comes to anyone who is now in a position to assign what you do. Right? Yes, he's vetted by the system, but you shouldn't have that much trust in any system. You should think about your own best objective future interests, and you can only outsource so much of that work to what the institution says is bankable or not bankable. At the end of the day, if it's more than just a passing kind of non-committal, quickie task, if it's anything more onerous than that, it can't be a stranger, no matter how well vetted it is, because then you're just not thinking about yourself. Then you're turning yourself into just this repository for the assembly line mindset. And see, I think that's where institutional trust goes awry. When these assignments really do feel excessive and onerous and even mind-stunting in the rare case, but the student feels it, he can't quite do anything other than escape the fact that he's slowly internalizing that and not thinking about it critically, because they still put themselves, they pay good money and accumulate tens of thousands of dollars of debt, tuition debt, simply because the system just screams it's the right thing to do. Because look, the professor is accredited in all the right ways, and you're interested in this domain of inquiry, and the professor knows exactly how you can turn this kind of you can turn it into a 360 win. You can turn it into a monetary win, plus you're intrinsically motivated by it. But are you intrinsically motivated by it? Or are you just doing it because in part the subconscious drive is that narrative about the college experience or even the university experience being in some way milestone pivotal? And so I don't think people are thinking about it pre-institutionally. They're not given a leg up to think about it from the standpoint of their ideally rational selves, which would be in line with their objective best interests. This requires thinking about yourself decades from now, and what kind of a person you're going to end up being, and how even the things that you're talented in don't necessarily mean the things that you are intrinsically motivated by. This is just so glaring to me because, like, the older I get, the more I realize that one thing that worsens me is the fact that I'm so into music, but I can only ever be into music as a appreciator of music, as a listener, because I'm about as musically talentless as it gets. And whatever I do excel at in terms of my strengths, that's not the sort of thing that I'm intrinsically motivated by. And just so there's no confusion, when I say in accordance to their best future selves, I'm not referring to some narrow achievement measure for what their best future selves. I'm talking about incorporating what we might think of as their own wisest possible values in accordance to their best future selves, which may not be achievement-centered values. It may not be accreditation. It may not even be informal education. There may be more things in the way of just pure understanding, which can't be measured a la simple, even informal education metrics. That's more in the realm of knowledge. Here I'm incorporating things like understanding and other kind of positive epistemic states, and we could even take it to other kinds of non-epistemic positive states. How fair they are as people, how enjoyable they're to be around, things of that sort. And if you got to drag them down in certain other ways to improve the achievement and the accreditation and even the informal education measure, but you will drag them down in other respects. Like, let me see if I can sketch a scenario. So you take a student who, under this current regime, would have been, let's say, a C- student, and in a different kind of regime, you bump them up to a B- student, but as a result of that, they actually do end up having a lower view of their intelligence because they're being comparative to other students who are lifted up even more. And so you improve them, strictly speaking. They actually might even know more. Their knowledge state is improved, not necessarily their understanding state, not necessarily even their state of wisdom, because the testing is just not there to, how can I best put it? Well, yeah, I can bring it back to the issue that I spoke at length about in the last video, this issue of interpretive drift, and how no one in the current regime that I'm aware of, the current educational regime, is a interpretive pluralist. If they were interpretive pluralists, they would not design the tests the way they designed them. Forget about the fact that the teacher doesn't solicit the thought process when the teacher grades the test. The teacher just looks at the actual things you circled. But it's even worse than that. It's the machine. If things are the way they were back when I was being graded, it's a machine that grades a lion's share of the test, because the lion's share of the test is multiple choice. I imagine those things have gotten even just more automated compared to my time. I imagine they've gotten even more automated since I was taking tests on a routine basis. Everything else has gotten more automated, so why wouldn't this have gotten more automated as well, right? But I'll double check that, and if I'm wrong, I'll do a little interference in this audio to point out that actually now teachers grade more than machines did decades ago. I highly doubt it. And so it's one thing to take a multiple choice test and to lower your view of your own intelligence by doing poorly when the human that grades it is not interested in your thought process. But it's even worse, it's even more insulting when it's a machine that grades it. And so how many students, this is what I asked in the previous video, but I really want to raise the question again. How many students, how many people have lived and died having their view of their own intellect artificially positively deflated because of their poor grades, or even artificially positively inflated because of their good grades, right? When all these things in the way of interpretive pluralism, things that the educational bureaucrat is simply not interested in, how you interpret the question, how there's valid reasons to interpret different questions differently by looking at what seems to be emphasized in the first part of the question, what seems to be emphasized in the latter part of the question, these different degrees of emphasis at the beginning, middle, end of the question, depending on how long-winded the question is, right? The more long-winded the question is, if it is worded carefully, the better. But if it's long-winded and it's not worded carefully, then you can just go based on purely different emphases in terms of how you interpret it. Purely different emphases can have you choosing both the D and the E based on those kinds of interpretations. And there's nothing, especially when it's a machine, but even when in the old school way, when it's simply a human being that looks at what you circle, there's nothing in the realm of multiple choice that actually solicits your thought process. And it's so insulting that so many people, this is why I take it beyond accreditation and even informal education, is because you can improve someone in those two ways. But still, in the process of improving them, if they're still underperforming compared to someone else, they're going to probably think, in the overwhelming majority of cases, they're probably going to think that someone else just must be outperforming them cognitively because of that, even though it's such a narrow range, even though no one's soliciting their thought process for why they chose D instead of E. And I didn't fully realize this until embarrassingly late. Like I talked about in the last video, I sensed something was wrong, and I was on my way to thinking about it purely critically, but I didn't achieve that until much later. And I would never have uttered a word like so-and-so is smarter than me because they aced that test and I didn't. I would never have uttered that as a sentence because I didn't believe it in a crystal clear way, but I internalized aspects of it. And it's infuriating when you see the very kids who, they can't hang with you conversationally. They can't hang with you in so many other ways that go beyond this narrowness of the test taking, this thought process blind narrowness of the test taking. It really was often the kids who were on the honor roll, they excelled at those tasks. And so I would have never uttered the possibility even that those kids are in fact on the whole cognitively superior, but I internalized parts of it, and I'm angry about that. And I'm sure that so many people, it's not just that they internalized it here and there. No, they internalized it from A to Z, and then they didn't think about it critically years or decades later the way I'm thinking about it now, because I've spoken to so many people who just like, I'm a dumbass. Like they think they think I'm too wordy. They think I'm using terminology that they can't hang with, even though I'm very careful with people nowadays. I'm much better than I was like 7 years ago in terms of, I can sense the word that people will not know, so I try to strive for a simpler word, but it just struck me recently how often someone just casually says, no, don't talk to me about that, I'm a dumbass. And it's not clear to me that they're a dumbass, it's just their vocabulary is not particularly wide. But why do they say these sorts of things? And so I started asking them, and then it always comes down to the fact that they got poor grades in school. I'm sure some of the time the kid who gets poor grades in school is the kid who's just low IQ. But the more I think about this valid sources of differential interpretations, which I'm going to call interpretive pluralism, which is not rewarded in these educational bureaucratic public schools, but it is rewarded very much when you get to the humanities in the post-secondary spheres of intellectual inquiry, which are, it can be argued, I think, those spheres of intellectual inquiry are more robust than what they search for in elementary school and high school. But that's a bit of a can of worms, and I don't want to get bogged down in trying to defend that, because then we might get into sciences versus humanities, like STEM versus non-STEM stuff, and I know that's a can of worms, because then I have to use philosophy to argue subjects that have to argue the merit of things the merit of subjects that themselves don't incorporate anything of philosophical import. And I know that's a bit of a chicken versus the egg sort of thing, and I don't want to go down that realm. But another thing that I also had a kind of trace of doubt back in the day, but I didn't really hang on it much, is just the fact that you wake up and you're in school within less than an hour of waking up. And so I can just get into the who's a morning person and who's not a morning person. The only thing they did to redeem themselves, the only thing they could possibly do to redeem themselves in this, is always have the gym class be the very first class. Always have PE as class number 1 in the morning. They did it a few times, but for the most part, gym would be the very last class. And I actually thought I enjoyed that, because when they went to 80-minute classes, that meant for us, we had 4 classes a day. So we had day 1 and day 2. 4 classes a day. You have 4 classes day 1, you have the other 4 classes day 2. Each class is 80 minutes. And so it pretty much means that when lunch starts, there's just 1 class after. And when that last class would be gym, well then school officially ends when lunch starts, because gym is just fun. It's not obnoxious to sit through the way so many other classes are, especially during morning time. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that I should have always preferred for gym to be the first class, because that would actually wake me up. Nothing else would wake me up. I'd be half asleep most of the time, simply because I'm not a morning person. And it doesn't matter whether it's actual morning, it simply matters how many hours removed am I from having woken up. Because I see this to this day. I'm working these night shifts, and until I get 2-3 cups of coffee in me, it's just very hard for me to pay attention. It's very hard for me to read and reply to emails. Especially if I sleep for more than like 6 hours the day before. If I get 6 hours of sleep and I'm at work within an hour of having woken up, even just people chatting me up, I have such little patience with them, because it's harder to insult them in a clever way if my brain is still in the process of waking up. So it impacts me negatively socially, and it sure as hell impacts me negatively intellectually. And when I just think of how many high stakes tests were doled out in the very first class, so I'm like an hour or 2 after having woken up. This is yet another thing. I'm sure if I actually had access to all these test results, just as I'm sure that I would find that the majority of red lines are going to be aggregated in the bottom half of the test, because that's when I see the other inarticulate students handing in their test, and those often being the students on the honor roll. I would also find that I'm sure maybe I should try to look up these tests. I'm sure they have them stored somewhere, but that would actually require heading back to that godforsaken place that I should never step back into, that being my old high school. But yeah, it is the test that I took pre-lunch versus the tests and exams that I took post-lunch, or just further out from the earliest class in the morning. I speculate that I always perform better on those tests, and just whatever times of the day we would have a gym class, and then the pre-gym versus post-gym test taking. Because nothing woke me up better than gym, and it's just yet another thing that I can't recall anyone making a big enough fuss out of. But what I do recall is kind of an uptick, when I really think about it, in people who casually refer to themselves as dumbasses, that having its roots in how they did in school. Because they just weren't given a leg up to think critically about what could have aided them as unique individual thinkers, because it was just the assembly line mindset. That's the biggest crime of all, I think. It's not just that they're not ideally served or anywhere close to well served based on some standard that vets for their future performance as workers and their future income and their just kind of future worldliness. They're not made into worldly thinkers by the way of the education system. It's not that. It's that it artificially, in some cases, it artificially lowers their view of their own intelligence based on how they perform. But they're not taking into account things like, how often did I take these tests early in the morning when I was half asleep versus after a gym class where I was perked up, where my mind had already perked up. They're just not thinking about that. So many people, I'm sure, have lived and died having their even self-esteem beyond the intellectual realm. But in my case, the most important would be within the intellectual realm, how this can be viewed, how public schooling, assembly line mindset can be viewed as a mind fuck to artificially lower the intellectual self-esteem of those who perform poorly on tests versus artificially inflate the intellectual self-esteem of those who perform well on the tests. It just did not take into account individual variation, and we should all be pissed off about it. But very few people seem to be. And so this is why this channel really is about the cultivation of ideas more so than contributing to any kind of already existing battle of ideas, right? The battle of the pre-existing ideas, I'm just so not interested in that, in part because I see how hard it is to change people's minds. So I'm always trying to reach for something that's more in line with the cultivation of ideas. Once the ideas are cultivated and widespread enough, then people can argue them however they like. But far more important is to cultivate ideas that are currently not being debated. And I just think that interpretive pluralism, huge red flag right now, something that is very much rewarded in, let's say, in non-STEM modes of intellectual inquiry, but it's just something that the educational bureaucrat doesn't even, I don't know, it just seems like this never even occurs to people. That you can know your material, you can study your material, you can see which answers are glaringly wrong, and still struggle with 2 of the 5 options on the test because of how you interpret the fucking question. And, you know, I can't help but view it as foul play on the part of Team Blue because they spend so much time talking about education and public education and reforming it, but these things never come up. Students should be vetted for whether or not they're morning people, whether or not they're speed readers, whether or not they're more autodidacts, and they're not being vetted for any of these things. And so, you know, I don't want to say, you know, spread this video. I don't want to say, I don't want to engage in any kind of self-promotion, but these points I made, make them. You don't have to share the video, but share the points by reiterating them next time you're in the vicinity of a conversation that's about reforming education. Because clearly, if my navigation of those conversations are anything to go by, the morning person, pre-gym, post-gym, testing, pre-gym, it doesn't even have to be testing. It's just even a matter of paying attention to the lesson. See, I hung on the test thing, but it's also just about attention qua attention. It was much easier to pay attention post-gym once I kind of sweated out my early morning just process of waking up. I'm not the kind of person who just wakes up. I have a long multi-hour process of waking up. And it hurt me a lot more in school because I didn't drink coffee back then. And so it's a crime that people lived and died. It's a crime that people lived and died, having this impact, not just their view of their own intellect, but even their self-esteem, thinking that it was a leveled playing field. It's not a leveled playing field. Some people just wake up, they get up, they're ready to go. Some people are not like that. Obviously, this will impact students. And if there's schools that don't even have PE, then I would just say push the school day up. Push the school day up, have it start no sooner than 10 or even 11 a.m. Have students be up for multiple hours. Or encourage them to drink coffee. See how they test in the afternoons, post-gyms, compared to morning. If it's just a pattern of worse test results early morning, encourage them to drink coffee. Get them to think about these things. These environment or otherwise temporal-based factors that clearly show a patterned impact on their performance. This can be done through the assembly line mindset. And reform of education should, the biggest bullseye that should be, in terms of the actual reformers, their biggest bullseye needs to be individual variation and how much harm comes by way of the assembly line mindset. So yeah, this is This is not the battle of ideas, because this is just me kind of cultivating ideas, cultivating new grounds for skepticism. And not just skepticism. It goes well beyond skepticism, if we're going to be really honest about it. It includes skepticism, but we're well past that now. We're even well past cynicism, extended toward the disciplinarian, officious, domineering, very much control freaky in terms of I am the elder, thus you listen to me, I know more about what's good for you than you do. This kind of textbook adultism is probably how it should be defined. The elder who thinks that me being elder qua elder, I know what's best for your future self-interest, even if it runs afoul of your ideally rational best future self. Because it's ultimately about the fact that it's a mindset where elder qua elder justifies the power. It's not any kind of individual variation. So it's a power dynamics thing as well. And it's kind of elder is right because he's elder. Elder ergo correctness. And so it's not just that we should be skeptical of that or cynical, it's that it warrants disdain and large amounts of disdain. And I'm not shying away from it. You're going to lower people's self-esteem, whether it's intellectual or post-intellectual, at its source, on the grounds of you wanting an efficient workforce. That's what it often is. And it's why so many people have status anxiety. It's so explanatory, and yet I don't really hear when people say they're going to therapy over their status anxiety or their neuroticism or this or that truly ails them, or these comparative sources of depression. This is not really ever brought up. How much they've probably internalized the fact that they may have done poorly in school and they're not even low IQ, but they just for some reason tested poorly. It's these environmental factors and temporal factors that the disciplinarian, officious asshole doesn't want to think about. I just find it hard to believe that there have been this many decades of public schooling across the world, and yet people have not took these sorts of issues and grievances seriously within the scholastic system. It's because they don't want to. That's why I call them school unions hacks. They're very much working for the school unions, hacks and special interests, more so than those individuals that are yet to be flourished, those best versions of each individual pupil. This warrants disdain, not just skepticism and cynicism. It's very hard to be civil to someone like Amy Wax or Heather McDonald, who they just think this system vets for the best of us. Granted, they would probably agree with many of these criticisms, but ultimately they would say private schooling is the lone source of the solution, or these vouchers, school choice. But then when you really look at the major differences between public and private schools, it doesn't get into this. What time of the day are you forced to pay attention during? It doesn't get into this. It's only the truly wealthy parents who can provide their children with a sort of responsible homeschooling. They get the perks of those benefits, because then it's not just that we lessen the assembly mindset, the assembly line mindset, but we totally eliminate it because it's just our own child learning in his own home environment. And Amy Wax and Heather McDonald, they're not the biggest proponents for homeschooling. They're biggest proponents for charter schools and these textbook private schools. So it's a halfway solution at best. The only way we can march toward the sort of solution that I clamor for here is by just declaring that the primary role of schooling has nothing to do with you becoming the optimal worker or the optimal contributor to society qua cognitive performer. If that is head and shoulders above all the other aims about ensuring that children develop in accordance to their own unique capacities as well as possible, being maximalists surrounding that, not workforce or accreditation, it's just going to be halfway measures at best. We have to recognize that these people warrant disdain, they're disciplinarian, they're officious, and they're obfuscators. Because there's no way I'm the only person. There's no way I'm the only person who's had these sorts of thoughts. There's a reason these sorts of thoughts didn't travel from within the school boards, from within the school system, as a bottom-up kind of pressure, exerting ideological pressure on the top-down forces. There's been enough decades right now. It has probably occurred to them. I said at one point it probably hasn't occurred to them, but it probably has occurred to them, and that's far worse. And they warrant disdain in an uncivil tone, and that's what I'm going to give them.
It's only nature's way. Cause and effect. Oh, it's a
One thing I just have to note, I'll discuss the implications of it in a different audio because I'm still just on the liftoff. But having chosen to narcissistically watch my own last video as I'm on a major liftoff after not having puffed for about 3 days, rare these days, but I had 3 straight days and now I'm just still on the liftoff. But I decided, instead of listening to music, I decided to put on my last video because I just, like everything else in Breaking Bad and other forms of fiction and music, just escalates and gets better. So too do my videos just when I'm on the liftoff. So I decided, is it going to be music for my video? And I thought it'd be music, and then I just reflexively went to the video and watched over half of it until I had a thought and decided I have to stop this and record an audio. But I didn't even think I would give it this prelude because I want this to be a very short audio. But so many things that I complain about would be settled by a true belief in hereditarianism in terms of what we can do with cognitive gifts and cognitive ailments. Just how much can we do? And so many people who fervently oppose hereditarianism are the ones who are responsible for these equally applied mandates in the form of educational regimens for pupils, for minors. I mean, last video, God, I'm just watching it right now. I'm just going on and on about the unfairness of this precisely because people won't grapple with the fact that something like reading speed is not easily adjustable. This is not an easily adjustable trait. And then I went into the fact that it's preposterous to assign students who read 3 or 4 or more times slower than other students. It is preposterous to assign them the same homework load. I should have hung on that point. Well, I'm going to hang on it now because I'm going to discuss briefly the implications of hereditarianism combined with a kind of equal respect for all minors. We don't respect unique cultures when it comes to the questions of minors and parental entitlement. Like unique cultures in combination with parental entitlement. That's not what we should fundamentally respect on the questions of what ought to be done with minors, and minors currently enrolled in school on compulsory grounds, but we can take it beyond the compulsory grounds. But here, let's just fixate on those because those are the implications from my last video. But what ought to be done with minors in terms of policymaking? Some kind of social engineering will be necessary, no doubt. We're not going to prosecute parents for imposing curfews. So safety is a big component of this, but safety on what grounds? Safety on the grounds of viewing all minors as fundamentally equal and trying to make their life prospects go as well as possible, but life prospects from the standpoint of their best future selves, each individual minor's best future self. No matter how we reform education, unless we incorporate the possibility of hereditarianism in combination with this equal respect for minors, hereditarianism here applying to cognitive gifts and ailments, it can apply to many other things. We don't challenge the hereditarianism of height inequalities because it would be so much harder to do so. Because it's so much easier to empirically measure this. Empirical measures of how well off someone is or how badly off someone is, just purely cognitively, empirical measures by way of IQ tests, they're not the whole story. But that doesn't mean that insofar as the IQ test does measure something, hereditarianism is very explanatory. And so this loops into the speed readers versus those who read much slower, and how we should value those who are slower if we value them as equal citizens, prospective citizens, from the standpoint of their own best future selves judgment, and legally entitled to proceed according to that. If we value them equally, then we're going to recognize that once they're out of school, those slower readers are entitled to an equal amount of their own non-scholastic free time. And the only way we can do that is if we differentiate homework loads on the basis of things like reader speed, and if you like, IQ test scores. Because they do administer IQ tests to very young children who just come of school age. The IQ test will obviously look a lot different, but it is predictive of future performance in IQ tests. And so it just struck me that the political coalitions in American politics that I tend to go easier on, in the form of whoever is represented by the DNC as opposed to the RNC, I tend to go easier on those whose interests are best served by the DNC as opposed to those whose interests are best served by the RNC, as measured by political success, or how their lives actually go qualitatively in some cases, but usually by way of their political ideology's success at the hands of the party that's governing them, that's representing them politically and ideologically, right? I cut so much more slack to Team Blue. I really do. And the fact that so much of Team Red is now okay with the January 6th narrative, even if they agree with the empirical aspects of that narrative, as they are told by the blue side, there's a lot of reasons to go easier on Team Blue than Team Red when we just think about that. The post-January 6th Team Red, the political actors, as well as the media pundits who do their bidding. There's so much reason to cut more slack to Team Blue, whatever Team Blue's flaws are. But if I think about it from the standpoint of my personal interests, because this does have carryover to our political parties as well, in terms of being represented by the school unions hacks and individuals of that sort. This barricade preventing the implications of hereditarianism from joining in on the discourse, this absolute barricade of preventing the uncontroversial tenets of hereditarianism from making their way into this discourse, even those uncontroversial tenets are barricaded. This is Team Blue all the way. So on one of my most fundamental issues, this is borderline wedge issue for me in terms of what we actually do with minors and those minors who may be slower paced in these various cognitive tasks that are mandatory for so long, for so much of their youth. I need to be a lot more hostile to Team Blue insofar as they serve those interests that propel those barricades and prevent hereditarianism, combined with equal respect for all minors as vetted by their future best selves. Those barriers are nearly all the product of Team Blue's activism and political success in that arena. Having listened back to that multiple times and still avoiding music, this is ill-advised, but I have to do another audio. Hope it's going to be shorter, but I do have to add one or a couple very important things. Hereditarian leftism is not an oxymoron. It has its advocates. They're not in the majority. They never have been, as far as I've studied, at least American political history. But when I think to one individual who has written extensively about the need to embrace hereditarianism from the standpoint of what is best for a kind of leftist politics, that individual, I forgot how many decades ago exactly the book was, but it was some decades ago, and I'm sure he's brought it up subsequently. I don't recall him having changed his mind on this, but one individual is an individual I briefly mentioned in the last video when I talked about the work that's been done in terms of animal interests, and that individual is Peter Singer. Peter Singer has brought up the issue of hereditarianism and how easily it can fit into standard leftist politics. He's given extensive reasons for why this fits, some of which I'm sure overlap with what I just went over in the audio covering what you just heard, these absurd equal applications of reading tasks and various other scholastic tasks, and not having them differentiated by actual cognitive indicators of how much time each pupil will take to perform all such tasks that the pupil is convinced are mandatory because they are in line with his best future self's judgment. You really convince a lot of children that they're being well served by spending this much time on these tasks. And I'm not going to go into Southeast Asia again. I'm not going to go to Russia again and those horror stories. But if anyone would like, I can go into those details. But the point is, only with a recognition of the role of hereditarianism as a kind of limiting factor in just how much we should expect of those slower readers, we can entitle them to more free time, because they absolutely would be in most cases if they're allowed to develop, if they're allowed to get to know themselves more, even in quiet solitude, but ideally at play with their young fellows. Just the extent to which we undervalue these scholastic norms, undervalue the value of play in childhood, this has contributed to the epidemic of youth, as measured by various things that Jonathan Haidt always goes back to. I'm sure that a significant aspect of this, driven by what he calls safetyism, a significant aspect of this is why most parks are empty. Pre-COVID, during COVID, now largely post-COVID, most parks are empty. When I was coming up, most parks weren't empty. The value of childhood play has been seriously overlooked by the drabby scholastic norms that I just kept going on about in my last video. And I can't view the omission of the role of hereditarianism. I cannot view that as merely incidental. That is fundamental as to why they can overlook something as vital as this. And there's been books written about this. I can't quote chapter and verse the authors, but I think I'll look up some posts or some podcasts, particularly Ezra Klein has hosted numerous people who emphasized the role of childhood and how directly correlated it was with future happiness. And individuals who remember, who've written at length about how this kind of observation that I just made in terms of empty parks and how different it was in their day, and how free time was just the norm for children in a way that they can't recognize now when they look at their children and even grandchildren in some cases. So I think it is only with the recognition of hereditarianism that we can get serious about this, because we would understand those limiting factors. Though I think hereditarianism, to convince me, wouldn't even be necessary. Even if you can enhance me as a cognitive performer at the expense of making me somewhat less happy or making me a somewhat less just person, but you still nonetheless enhance my best self from the standpoint of me being a cognitive performer and a kind of productivity-based, measured contributor to society. No. If you make me a less fundamentally happy person, if you make me a less self-respecting person, if you make me a less enjoyable person to be around, and if you make me less fair, I'm going to say that no system of social engineering should be set up to contribute to that. Because I sure as hell wouldn't want to end up as one such person. And I think I don't see many people who reach their ideally rational selves. Honest to God, I don't see many people who are as close to that as myself, taking a third-person objective, as close to possible, watching my own videos pre-high and post-high. So I think, although I haven't reached my ideally rational self, obviously, when I say that I wouldn't want myself to have turned out any differently by being born and raised in somewhere along the lines of Southeast Asia or Russia, where I heard these horror stories paralleled by my friends who had now luckily escaped and who are now just completely shocked at how easy the Canadian educational system is compared to what they came from. When I hear that and I apply my ideally rational self as the ultimate judger, who I believe I'm close to, I can't feel that anything other than an appreciation for how lucky I was to have skirted those regions, regardless of how those regions would have led to me being well served from that accreditation standpoint. Fundamentally, I'm not interested in being well served by the accreditation standpoint. I want to be best served by my future ideally rational self's judgment in accordance to that. So I was going to loop this into, just as they refused to heed Peter Singer's advice in terms of incorporating hereditarianism into not just their political doctrines, but also their political activism. We likewise see an unwillingness to incorporate anything from the standpoint of evolutionary psychology into their gender politics. And so you get absurd views that I haven't covered yet, even though I finished my gender trilogy. That fifth, remember in the first video I said 4/5? I don't want to come on here and say 4/5 only. Well, that actually ended up happening. I didn't get into what is very likely to get me branded as a male supremacist. But it's so sub-rational, and that's putting it politely. And it's so visceral. But what I refer to here is the unwillingness to incorporate any of the findings within evolutionary psychology to this issue of gendered violence and domestic violence, because ultimately they will always attribute it to a culture of misogyny. And I don't think you can do that when you take seriously even a quarter of the findings in evolutionary psychology, if I have some say in determining what's going to go into that quarter. And this is why, when they always go back to that constructivist angle, they will fail to grapple with the underlying issues. And they will come up with absurd legal code like femicide, and not just come up, but now will want to enhance yet further still, because they fail to recognize that these two individuals that were involved in this incident of gender violence, this is a kind of pre-selected tango in line with our strategy mate selection, in line with these people having had a dramatic upbringing, leading to them being operationally, in terms of their sexual mating strategy. This is a kind of operational profile, leading to them being products of our selected environments, grew up alongside a lot of siblings, things always had a fast pace. And so they are the operationalized vessels, essentially. They're just life's vessels, but they are operationalized by fast life history strategy. And instead of talking about changing the legal code in terms of being combating the culture of misogyny, far more of these people, had they taken evolutionary psychology seriously, far more of them would have been able to accept that this is a kind of, these men who killed these women, this is a kind of pre-selected tango. This was genetically destined in some sense, but this so appalls them. And so instead of getting to the root of the issue, they will try to tell us that we cannot walk and chew gum at the same time. We cannot judge the prudentially bad act or the prudentially bad decision on the part of the woman who was murdered, we cannot say that is prudentially bad, that at T1, she could have spotted all the red flags. But since she was so sexually attracted to, at least in part, behavioral traits that would get you categorized as being someone who exhibits red flags, because so much of their attraction to these men hinged in part on that. In concert with that, maybe I can say, because it's so much of it, it's not all of it, so that's the share, but that it's in concert with how these behavioral traits, such as cockiness and levity, how there was a kind of correspondence to the fact that he was tatted up and muscular, because he was, in many cases, an ex-con. This does emit a kind of, as best I can tell, a kind of sexual glow on the hands of numerous heterosexual women, and that's not just speculation. The part I'm speculating here is, what is that numerous, what is that actual number? But we know it's some significant enough number of sexually liberated, especially heterosexual women. It's that tatted up kind of figure in concert with these cocky and brash and levity-based behavioral traits, and even tones, winking, just never showing frustration over anything, whether it's in the personal realm or impersonal realm. Look, a lot of the PUA hacks have hacked this, and this is what a lot of this advice comes down to. Never show the least bit of frustration. Never show the least bit of frustration in the sexual arena or hell, outside of it. Just build up this reputation of being chill at all times, of being suave at all times, and that's what'll get you numbers, right? And so I would just say, like, why are you concerned with numbers? Why do you want to fundamentally change your vibe as a human being and how you come across, and this concealment of your true self, this inhumane concealment of your truth self, just to advance your numbers, right? Because you're hacked by evolutionary psychology. The very findings in evolutionary psychology reveal that by doing so, by participating in that, whether or not you're successful in upping those numbers, you show yourself to be a mere vessel of life. So to all the PUA hacks, you're just vessels of life. Or you're not. You recognize how pathetic and thirsty it is to, especially if you solicit money from these men, you recognize them as just being life's vessels and being willing to take advantage of them. And make no mistake, to the extent that women are just these biological marionettes in the form of getting together with these dangerous men, so too, I would not shy away from using a term as strong as biological marionettes to refer to the men who even take the advice of a free dating roach, let alone one who solicits money for their scam, or maybe not even scam. See, I can't use words like scam because it can work, but it can only work at the expense of fundamentally changing what kind of a person you are or what kind of a person you exhibit and exude onto the world. How could that possibly be worth numbers? The closest I'll come to tolerating that is if a man is actually an adult virgin and he just doesn't get anywhere unless he applies that. So that's his kind of last resort. Then I'm going to say you still shouldn't do it. But obviously, I'll go easier on you if you do it as compared to a man who just wants it because he's that thirsty for that next number. To the extent that they're both life's vessels and biological marionettes, they're not so equally. Because that latter man who already has something of a body count, but who just needs to increase it, it's just more in line with what I'm going to call patheticism. Basic bitches, all, by definition, fall in line with one or another aspect of patheticism, just as that type of man who needs to be either the player or even in the worst cases, the slayer. And there's no end to the amount of individual obfuscation he'll engage in, self-obfuscation even, shying away from his truer self, and things in the line of authenticity, but that's kind of a can of worms, the word authenticity. So I'll just say in line with their truer self, their ideally rational self, they're just willing to conceal even from themselves these sides if by doing so they get to increase their numbers and not just go from non-player to player, but then also in the worst cases from player to slayer. And at the end, there's just nothing left but a shell of a human being. It's my friend who I talked about, the first gender video. I guess I had to get specific enough, because then it would just seem like it was kind of not applied to anyone. But yeah, I am thinking of a specific individual from my deep past with whom I had so much in common and who's now such a shell of himself because he would have just been that frustrated as a non-player. And so maybe if he read some evolutionary psychology and accepted it and seen how that's nothing to do with him. That's just the biological pressures and various forms of evolutionary mind games that led him to make those kinds of decisions and fundamentally change how he comes across. He has such night and day vibe that he exudes last time I ran into him compared to how we were for several years coming up. This was fundamentally because of the procedure he had to have a few months after I gotten to know him. This fundamentally altered and perverted and warped his vision of himself. And the only antidote, in his mind, was to become a player. And that's why in terms of how he comes across, it's a night and day scenario. And by leaps and bounds, a lot of people change, but the extent to which my former BFF, pseudo BFF changed, it's just having so much weight when I think about it after I get high. As I'm still high. But I wish he had read evolutionary psychology, because then you can see the ways in which you're hacked. And I wish a lot of these radical activists, let's keep it kind of vague, these never enough activism types come up with obscene legal codes to stiffen the penalties when a woman is killed within a sexual or otherwise romantic or spousal context by her lover, whether that's an ex-lover or current lover, present boyfriend, ex-boyfriend, present husband, ex-husband, right? It's in that kind of a romantic and sexual, intimate context, but she gets killed by him. They believe the penalty should be stiffer. They're so blasé about it. They believe the penalty should be stiffer when that happens than when a woman kills a man in the exact same kind of circumstance. Whatever her reasons. The reasons can be purely identical, but they're ultimately driven by some kind of romantic or sexual scorn, but the two were together and things were like amicable enough. And so in both cases, it's a product of pre-selected tango. And you're not going to do away with it if you talk about the culture of online misogyny. Any more than women are going to stop killing men, the more the MRAs talk about the culture of internalized or otherwise brash open misandry. These people are going to keep doing what they're going to keep doing. These people, because of their sexual operationalized strategy, which is that fast life strategy, they're going to find each other. And I think this is one reason why, to this day, so much of the non-Western world has such rigid standards for monogamy and chastity, premarital chastity, and just kind of a anti-exhibitive culture. These cultures, if anything, they are not sexually exhibitive. Because I think what happens in sexually liberated societies in the form of this pre-select tango leading to the cultivation of politics that give rise to doctrines of legal femicide without anything comparable on the male part, this is so appalling in part because of ovarian protectionism. And this is why these sexually non-exhibitive societies, they so want to prevent this kind of pre-selected tango from happening. There is literally no end to the amount of social engineering that they will be willing to tolerate, and here specifically romantic, marital, and really sexual forms of social engineering. They will engineer to their heart's content if it takes having such a rigid society where it was only recent that women got the right to drive, because it obviously sexual social engineering is going to spill over to so many other things outside that explicit sexual arena. And the takeaway I have from that is a lot of things that don't seem sexual are still sexually relevant. Are you going to completely disconnect the fact that it was only recently that Saudi Arabian women, with the influence of Western media, that is a very sexually exhibitive, tolerant media, right? We interfuse these cultures in the digital age, And that suddenly has kind of a spike in the sort of political agitation to give women the right to drive. We're going to keep seeing this through this restricted world. The most restricted parts of the world are going to, at least in certain sexually non-obvious ways, they're going to get certain rights that they've never had, and that many of them will probably not want to exercise. I doubt there's that many Saudi Arabian women who have taken up their right to drive, which is a good thing. I haven't taken up my right to drive because it's just another money suck, and I don't need it. And I can see how certain things that would be, if I were to go out of my way to actually get my full drivers, the only motivation there would be the sort of thing that is in line with evolutionary psychology, not something that's in line with what my ideally rational self would want me to do. But returning to the repression, sexual repression as a tool for preventing sexual tragedy, I think that's a good way to summarize it, actually. What these countries tolerate in the form of social engineering is a kind of sexual repression that aims to prevent sexual tragedy and even sexual atrocity. And the liberal West just has no patience for that, because in part they're driven by this belief that none of this is explained by factors like fast life history strategy, and those two people eventually finding each other, and that not being something that can be regulated. The best way to try to regulate it is in terms of education, and trying to see themselves, trying to really drill into their minds that these kinds of incidents have happened to you men who sought out dangerous women or who failed to see red flags in women. These are the types of women who did this, and these are the types of women who might do this to you if you insist on being a player or slayer, because you just up the odds of running into a nutcase. And I would assume they're more overrepresented among the outgoing types. The nutcases, the worst of women, you're more likely to run into one if you go to hang out in one of these sleazy environments that I've also had my kind of, I need to return to, but I've ranted about it enough, like 3 or 4 videos ago. These truly sleazy environments, you up the odds of having something really bad happen to you. Insofar as we can vet that there's a dark triad overrepresentation. It's not a rock solid connection, and I'm going to try to retrace my steps to vouch for the specific papers, but both among men, among outgoing nightlife loving men and women, there's an overrepresentation there compared to the general population. There's more dark triad types who come along for that kind of ride. And so it's not about a culture of misogyny or a culture of misandry. It's about a culture of overlooking the bane of fast life history strategy. That's what it is. That's how I would summarize it. We overlook it, we don't want to accept it, and I'm using we in that ridiculous, playful way again. It's not me, and it's probably not you if you're listening to this video. You may not have read anything specifically about fast life history strategy, but the kind of normie that I bring up politics to, at work or outside of work, one of the locals here, they've never really read anything about hereditarianism. So it's not just that Team Blue necessarily deflects from the information, the ordinary representatives of Team Blue who just vote that way. It's not necessarily that they have no patience for this. I think the highly trained professionals who are obfuscators on how fast life history strategy makes it really hard to prevent these sorts of things, and really the highest odds of success are the sort of levels we see, the sort of levels of sexual repression we see in these sexually backwards, as we would view them, sexually backwards countries. And I would say it's not worth the price, but I have my own reasons. It's not just, those reasons don't just have to deal with harm prevention. Those reasons are, now I'm pretty damn good at spotting who in my life or in my past was a slow life history strategist and a fast life history strategist. I'm able to put people in these two buckets in a way that it's very hard for me to put people in buckets in other ways, like which individual is politically bad and which individual is politically good. It's very rare that I tell myself these stories that I'm willing to round off someone. You have to be a pretty absurd and obscene person, just personally, for you to have that impact your politics to the point where I would lump you into one of those two camps. And it certainly doesn't follow any kind of partisan party affiliation pattern. So I have trouble lumping people into strong and weak buckets. I have trouble lumping people into good or bad buckets, because people can be one or the other in so many different ways. But one thing that's glaring to me, then, think about the people that I've known and the people that I sense I know based on how they go about their online personalities. I can put people in these slow and fast life, history, strategy, ultimately ecology buckets. And the culture doesn't want to have a serious discussion about that. And maybe you think that the culture is having a serious discussion on hereditarianism, but I'd like to see what that looks like. I'd like to see recent examples. There's a reason no one ever references Peter Singer's book about the left hereditarians. I listened back to that part of the audio and I wish I hadn't used left, because now I have to do the obligatory qualifiers that no one should ever use these played out terms. These terms were played out the moment it stopped being the very original thing. The moment it stopped being synonymous with the monarchists versus the Republicans, right? When we lost that originalist interpretation of the words and they flung outward to the left was now going to be synonymous with class solidarity along the lines of some Marxist perspective or post-Marxist perspective, but at the root we were going to have it mean class solidarity and worker pride and labor unions and who knows, maybe things beyond that, right? That was going to be kind of synonymous with what the left meant, but it was no longer that original anti-monarchist, republicanist, small r republicanist position, true conviction, kind of core political conviction embedded in leftism. Then we should have just stopped using the word leftism altogether. And at the moment, I guess rightism started being about whatever the hell they lunged from post-monarchy. I guess they lunged toward hardline nationalism as a kind of core component of it. And then, at least in America, Christian nationalism. But yeah, we should have long ago stopped using these terms. And now they just get to be conveniently misapplied, right? Because half the time, or something like half the time, it's just a stand-in for party affiliation. And then the other half of the time, like AOC swoops in and says, what? No, we don't have the left in America. I have this historical, sophisticated view of what the left is, and none of my colleagues qualify for that. Ooh, look at how I just truth-bombed this entire discourse. It's like, yeah, but there's other instances in which you're perfectly willing to use the category of the right as just a stand-in for the GOP, for the party affiliation, instead of taking that deeper historical century-spanning look into the history of the right, starting with the monarchists, and then evolving from whatever it was, post-monarchism, when monarchism was no longer the core political commitment of what was used verbally as rightism. Just as with leftism, at some point it stopped fundamentally being about opposing monarchy through small r republicanism. It's like, that was it. We should have stopped using it. We should never let words take on, at least words within a single discipline like political theory, right? I understand words are going to be used differently across different disciplines of various things, of various forms of study, but within politics, it just took on different meanings. And sorry for the tangent, but yeah, people need to read not just at length about hereditarianism and the pro and nay components for specific kind of claims hereditarianism makes. It makes a whole spectrum of claims, because there's a whole spectrum of traits that we all either inherit or acquire largely through the environment. And so hereditarianism, it's a brochure. It's not a single thing. Maybe that'll be the title of the video, The Brochure of Hereditarianism. But see, then they would probably get snarky and put a little dash, a little hyphen between the bro and the rest of the word to say that it's a bro ideology. Because I guess they're just that spiteful, because they know hereditarianism would render useless so much of their political rhetoric. Because it's a descriptive thing. It can be combined, just as I talked about it in the case of minors. It can be combined for the equal respect of minors, and then truly advance the slower-paced minors' interests. And then in the gender context, it can be used to identify a particular form of pathology born of fast life history strategy. and that certain people are going to just tango, and you shouldn't use that as a narrative formation. When certain people tango and one of them murders the other, regardless of whether it's the man murdering the woman or the woman murdering the man, these should not shape larger gender discourse, the fact that these incidents happen. Just as we wouldn't shape gender discourse by looking at the happiest marriages. Right? Imagine that. We just all became obsessed with the idea of not trying to prevent, as in the former case, but just all trying to emulate whatever these two individuals did who had like the happiest marriage of all time, and we all strove to emulate them so we can have the happiest marriage of all time. Like, that shouldn't be a driving force. If some people want to do that, fine, but that shouldn't be a driving force within gender discourse. The driving force within gender discourse needs to be the sort of stuff I talked about in my 3 gender videos. And then this fourth or fifth component is the most dangerous component, because I'm challenging the sacred cow of the idea that something like femicide should be a part of the legal code. And I wouldn't say correct for it by coming up with a equivalent, a kind of balls protective equivalent on the form of the male victims. No, we just need to drop the first one and have punishment be proportional to the crime, irrespective of the perpetrator's gender and the victim's gender, or the biological sex. And yes, I know I'm keeping all of this heteronormative still. I am just not even giving a brief call out, shout out to the queer folk. I'm going to talk about queer theory too at some point, but this is just appallingly long. I didn't think I would cover so much, but yeah, at some point queer theory, and then I'm probably done with gender for good. But yeah, fast life history strategy, I'm probably going to flash a bunch of things pertaining to it, papers and things of that sort. And you all should read up on it, because it's pretty damn sexually explanatory, and it explains a lot of tragedy in the gender domain.